Hello and welcome to another AST virtual event. Hope everyone's well. It feels like it's been a little while since we've done one of these. Potentially, I think it's the first of 2024. But the good news is we are back and we have got a few more planned as well. I think several actually over the next kind of 4 to 6 weeks. So that March break with the fixtures, don't worry, we'll make sure we keep you busy going into a very busy April, which looks like quite an exciting season so far. So that's obviously great. So welcome to our existing members, welcome to all of our new members. Um, I'm about to bring on our guests. It will run in the normal format. So if you do have a question, you can put your hand up and we'll try and bring you in when possible, or you can use the Q&A function. It's been quite an exciting one. I think a lot of people have asked us about sort of governance of football and stuff like that. And obviously that's something the AST have been here to educate on. So really am looking forward to this evening and to learning a lot more from our guests. So I will hand over to Tim and Nigel and also welcome Nick. And I'm going to step off screen for a little while. So over to you guys.
Thank you, Akio, and hello everyone. Really pleased this evening that we have as a guest someone who has been a guest before. Those of you that remember our meetings in Holborn will remember Nick presenting some really interesting work. I think it was on Arsene Wenger and the budget available to him and how his budget matched up. And Nick has long been a friend of the AST and a journalist who has covered football finance and governance and stories in detail. And we're really pleased to have you today. First of all, Nick, before we perhaps get into the topic of the night, just say hello yourself and introduce your work and what you're doing now.
Hi, Tim. I'm a journalist. Started out as a foreign correspondent in the 90s on a Japanese newspaper and made the perfectly natural progression into sport. I was a staff writer, sports news reporter at The Independent from the end of the 90s until 2010. I started the Sporting Intelligence website in 2010, but and that has run pretty much since. But after about 10 months of that, I was headhunted by the Mail on Sunday, who wanted an investigative reporter. And I also spent a year in between working for the Sunday Times as well. So I've worked on national newspapers, covering sports news, sports investigations, breaking stories such as the Russian state's doping, program, which broke in July 2013, 8 months ahead of Sochi, and the authorities just completely ignored the story and let it happen. Governance stuff, FIFA stuff, a lot of stuff about owners, because of course, if you've got a club with a good owner, then you're off to a really good start. Sports finance, sports business, doping, a whole range of stories. And as of November last year, I've now moved Sporting Intelligence, and it is now operating on Substack and has been for, well, this is the end of the 5th week on Substack. I know you'll be circulating some materials at some point after this, and there's some details of how you can find where you can find Sporting Intelligence and the Sporting Intelligence Substack. So that's what I do. And now I'm effectively freelance running the Substack. I'm also doing some script writing. I'm doing some consulting, as I've done for a number of years, with lawyers and people around football salaries. I actually did some work with Arsenal a few years ago, which I don't think I've ever told you about. I'm working with a Danish football media company called Off the Pitch to develop a salary tool, which is actually already commercially available. And doing some writing, doing some podcasting stuff. Portfolio career, and it's quite interesting.
Oh, well, I can certainly recommend to everyone signing up to your Substack, because I think a piece of information arrives each morning, and it's very rare that I don't think, I've got to read this. It's about football salaries or something in the game or something that's happened in sport, and we will provide that link to everybody. In terms of tonight, the AST has long been very interested in the finances of football, how it's governed, the debate over FFP. More recently, we gave evidence to Tracy Crouch supporting the call for a football regulator. We went to a European Congress meeting with football supporters and called on UEFA to distribute their finances in a more even way for competitive balance. So the issue of money and who has it in football and whether it's fair and what the rules should be is absolutely at the heart of what we do. And I can just see, looking at the screen now, 150 members have come through to listen to this, which is a huge number, bigger than our average meeting turnout, and shows the interest. Of course, in the immediate sense, we've got the situation that we know there are 115 charges laid against Manchester City. We've seen Everton lose points, appeal, still lose some points, but less. We know Forest are also being charged. So it's a hugely topical subject. You, I think, broke the first stories on Manchester City when they were charged by UEFA, and an issue that went to CAS. And then you followed that issue throughout the Premier League, introducing rules up to the time where Nigel is the expert on this. He's always reminding me the date of the charges and the 115. But it's a big story in itself. And of course, it really interests our members, because what happens to Manchester City really matters when you're 1 point behind them in the Premier League and competing with them for a title. So can I hand over to you and perhaps get you to do a bit of an overview of your work here, go back to the beginning of the story around Manchester City and the charges, where the Premier League now, give everyone an update, and then we'll go to a Q&A, which Nigel and myself will try and pick up questions from the chat. Akil might bring someone in. But over to you, Nick, to kind of tell us the story.
Thanks, Tim.
Before we get, what's really brought it into focus, Nick, is people know this has been going on, but it's very detailed. It's sort of in the background. There's appeals and everything. Everton being deducted 10 points absolutely makes people think these things are serious, and it affects the league table, and it's going to affect relegation and everything else. So I think the level of interest in the stuff that you've done is absolutely peaked, because clearly the Premier League is trying to demonstrate to any future regulator that it's got proper teeth and stuff. So as Tim says, the backstory of what you've been doing over the last decade or so on this one and where we are now will be absolutely fascinating for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about the Everton case. I mean, the 10-point deduction just killed the January transfer window in the Premier League, because everyone is now so terrified about having to make the PSR restrictions. The transfer window is effectively dead. Obviously, Everton are now facing a second charge, as are Forest. I'm sure Chelsea will be charged quite soon as well. And then we do have the 115 City charges. I thought if I just sort of go through basically a bit of background and try and keep it as simple as possible for this. I'd also like to say I'm really honoured that you've invited to be here. I was really enjoyed it in 2013 when we went through the whole of Wenger's career and looked about whether he was value for money in effect. And I should stress that you guys invited me to come. I didn't sort of write you a letter and beg to come on Arsenal Supporters Trust Zoom call to talk about Man City and FFP as if it's a hobby of mine. But anyway, so Tim sort of, when he invited me, he said, could we have an overview of the charges against City? Those are the charges, 115 of them levied against Manchester City in February of last year, 4.5 years after the Premier League began their investigation. How the case will be heard and the sanctions, what they could be, why this case is taking longer than the Forest and Everton cases, and the timetable of what happens next and what it could mean for the Premier League and indeed Arsenal or other clubs who feel they might have been affected. So a bit of background first. UEFA developed the financial fair play towards the end of the noughties with a stated aim of trying to cut out losses and debts at clubs across all 55 of UEFA's football nations. The architects were not a cartel of rich clubs wanting to pull up the drawbridge, as you'll often hear, without proof, but principally 8 independent experts under the chairmanship of the former Prime Minister of Belgium. And another of the experts, I'm sure a lot of your members will know, the late Brian Lomax, who is the much admired founding father of the Supporters Trust movement in Britain. When you get the notes tomorrow, whenever there's a background on all that there, Brian was a militant in some way. He really wanted to try and ban the Glazers' leverage buyout of Manchester United and all sorts of things, but they had to work within the European law, and they came together to have the FFP rules that comprised a set of common sense regulations dealing with, like, making sure you pay your financial obligations to each other, to finding accurate information. And the break-even requirement was the most controversial element of FFP, allowing clubs only to lose 45 million euros over a 3-year period. You could spend unlimited amounts on stadiums, infrastructure, facilities, academies, youth development, women's football, community projects, and other good investment. But the point of the rules was to make sure that you weren't hemorrhaging money. The first monitoring period for FFP was actually a 2-year cycle. the 2011-12 and 12-13 season, and it was obvious to me as far back as 2011 that City were willfully overspending and would definitely fail FFP. It was clear as day, and I wrote in a piece which we'll get a link to that it is inevitable City will fail to meet the first FFP target. This wasn't guesswork. The maths in that piece, which you can read, was written in November 2011. I knew people at City, had a good professional relationship with them and the club. There was an open acknowledgement, if not for reporting on the record, that City were pursuing a policy of accelerated investment. The hierarchy believed they would be able to use cover accounting to get away with overspending or assume that UEFA wouldn't come down hard on them. City could have spent less, not moved as quick as they did on transfers and wages, and not failed FFP. They opted not to do that. It was a choice. It was a risk, but it was a choice. And of course, they failed FFP at the first hurdle and were punished for doing so in 2014. City failed, and it was fairly obvious from the official settlement agreement, which will also be linked in the notes, in which they agreed to initially pay a 60 million fine, later reduced to 20 million euros, and agreed not to repeat some of the activity that led to the failure. In short, artificially inflating their income, specifically in relation to two of their sponsorship deals with Arba and Etisalat, but also through £47 million of concocted income by the sale of intellectual property. City also agreed as part of this settlement agreement to squad limits, spending limits, and to an ongoing and in-depth monitoring of their finances. And this deal was basically brokered by UEFA's then president, Gianni Infantino. Some City fans to this day insist that the club did not break any rules, had never admitted to breaking any rules, were never guilty of any FFP infringements. And in a podcast that was released just this week, a City fan and former advisor, Stefan Borsa, and I, Stefan's also a lawyer, argued this, whether this was the case. Stefan's case is that they've never admitted to guilt. They didn't fail FFP. And this was just a normal piece of a normal settlement involving 60 million and then a 20 million fine and all these different caveats. But it was absolutely clear that City did infringe FFP. And by 2016, when I'd spoken to a lot of the people around the whole process and find out what the investigators actually found, I revealed that City had come close to getting kicked out of the Champions League, but agreed the plea bargain to avoid that punishment, as did Paris Saint-Germain at the same time. My sources include staff inside City who knew they'd been lucky to get away with a fine, and people with knowledge of the audit that uncovered City's cheating, their overspending, their failure of FFP, which led to the 2014 punishment. City received, for example, a 5 million bonus for one of their sponsors for winning the 2013 FA Cup final, which was odd because the 2013 FA Cup final ended Manchester City 0, Wigan 1. The Guardian in 2020 also revealed that UEFA's auditors of City in 2014 were denied access to full financial records to do their job, that City had in fact posted excess losses of 180 million instead of 45 million euros, and City were punished back in 2014, not unfairly, but for creative accountancy, basically. So far, so simple. Unbeknownst to anyone at UEFA, when the 2014 fine was meted out, but later revealed by a Football Leaks document, Simon Pearce, a board member, as one of the most senior advisors to Sheikh Mansour and Abu Dhabi, had written in December 2013 to Peter Baumgartner of Etihad, City's main sponsor, detailing how Etihad would just provide just 8 million of £99 of Etihad sponsorships. Again, in the materials, you'll see that email, which is a part of a tranche of documents which you can find links to. When UEFA again found City guilty of financial irregularities, and when they were initially banned from the Champions League for 2 years, and they appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport in 2020, Simon Pearce, author of that email, was asked at CAS, have you ever arranged any payments to be made to Etihad in relation to its sponsorship of Manchester City? And he said, absolutely, categorically not, which seems a direct contradiction of the what was in the email. Obviously, me and other journalists asked the club if there was an explanation. They just said that there's an organised and clear agenda against the club. Organised by who? No comment. And so
Nick,
on. Yeah.
just a clarification there
Yeah.
for me, and I'm sure others. Explain to us why City would be repaying Etihad such a large sum of money. Why would they have to pay their main sponsor 89-90 million pounds?
Well, the central allegation here, and it is laid out in the email, is that Etihad actually didn't want to be spending £67.5 million a year on a £35 million shirt and a £15 million stadium when there was no football stadium in the world like anywhere near that then or now. In fact, in 2013, when City was supposedly receiving 15 million for Etihad for stadium naming rights, there wasn't a more expensive naming rights deal in the whole world in any sport.
What are Arsenal getting for the Emirates then, Nigel?
It's about £2.5 million per season, which is less than the receipts for one game at Arsenal.
Yeah, and I mean, like you say, it's been a low single-digit figure for Arsenal. Arsenal have obviously got the Emirates package, which is the shirt as well, but there just isn't a naming rights culture for, well, there was for your new build, of course, and you still didn't get very much for it, but there isn't for existing stadiums. This wasn't Virgin naming rights for the Etihad. It had already been the City of Manchester Stadium and whatever.
Nick, join the dots for me here. I don't think there's any smoking gun here. Manchester City have received money into their account.
Yeah.
Are then paying money back to their sponsor to get them down to the proper level. I mean, where that money has come from to make the repayment is the owners, correct?
Yeah, I mean, from the evidence we've seen, including the email, it's when Simon Pearce talks about "we owe you," he's saying "we," and he was writing from an email account of the Abu Dhabi government, effectively saying "we owe you this much." And the email, which you'll see when you get the materials, actually lays out that he, i.e., the Abu Dhabi government, he's emailing in that context, will be paying Etihad. Now, similarly, back in 2014, I had heard via an intermediary, but someone in the Etihad sponsorship department in Abu Dhabi was pretty annoyed that there was all this noise around what was initially being touted as a 340 million 10-year deal from 2011, because Etihad had a really good sports sponsorship business that was paying effectively sensible arm's length rates to, for example, sponsor a stadium in West London, which was in the flight path of Heathrow, which was a major hub for Etihad, for paying, sponsoring the Etihad Stadium in Melbourne, which was in the flight path. There was a very coherent, cogent policy that they weren't just spending tens of millions of pounds on sports sponsorship. So this one being so big was a bit strange. But that is, I mean, in a sense, that this is kind of the gravest allegation, I suppose, that disguised funding has been paid and that it's come ultimately from the Abu Dhabi government. I was told that there were people in the sponsorship department who were unhappy that Etihad sponsorship department was having to be part of this. I ran it past City. Of course, they said no comment. A City fan who was into football finance at the time told me the same thing later that year in an email, saying that the money was coming via Etihad, not from Etihad. And of course, with anyone involved in these things, you're not going to get anyone in Etihad or someone who's worked for City or City Football Group to go on the record and say, this is what we were doing. Yeah. But so does that answer your question?
Perfect. I didn't want to put you off your chronology there, but I think it's important to know it's a carousel of money.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of money. The documents, and we can come to this later, why these emails and various documents are not in and of themselves evidence that will have to be accepted without question. But just because something says something in an email doesn't mean it happened exactly like that. It looks like it, but the Premier League will have had to gather their own evidence and spent 4.5 years doing so before charging. They saw what happened at CAS. They saw the tactics City used. They saw the apparent perjury. They saw all different aspects of the process. And so they should be well armed with knowledge and presumably a level of evidence before pushing a nuclear button on charging one of your own member clubs with 115 charges. That is the most incendiary thing they could possibly have done. And if they're not doing that with some degree of confidence that some, if not all, of the charges are going to stick, I've said this before, but that will be the most monumental act of folly in British sports governorship, I think. Because City, how many times have they won the title? Is it 7 in the Premier League? Since 2012, they're reigning Champions League champions, favourites to win the Champions League again, reigning world champions, and they're owned by the Deputy Prime Minister of a political ally of Britain. I mean, it's monumental. So anyway, that's that. So so that was that. So City were charged a second time by UEFA with various counts of alleged financial wrongdoing after the Football Leaks documents entered the public domain. Some of the stuff the Football Leaks covered, I covered in my 2016 story, without any leaked documents or hacked documents or whatever, just doing normal journalistic sources. And the documents, a lot of the documents entered the public domain via Football Leaks. These dealt with allegations of impropriety. The Football Leaks overall was impropriety by dozens of football clubs and individuals over a long period of time. It wasn't targeting City, it was targeting dozens of football clubs and people for everything from tax evasion and financially related corruption and tax avoidance to sexual offences. I mean, it was the hacker, Rui Pinto, who you know, we obviously believe did obtain these by hacking, and when he was on trial, he was absolutely
Nick, just tell everybody a little bit more about who Rui Pinto was and what happened, rather than the hacking, because I think some people might not know that story, and it's central to this, isn't it?
Yeah. So Rui Pinto is a Portuguese guy. He's only in his 30s now. He was actually, his day job was antiques salesman. He was an antiques collector and trader. But he was a massive football fan. He is, I can't remember which of the Portuguese teams he supports, but he's a big football fan. I wouldn't say he was an activist, but he was dismayed at the way in which football was going in terms of finances and dodginess. He knew, you know, there were all sorts of stories about tax evasion and dodgy transfers and corrupt owners and money. He basically, well, I mean, we don't know, because I don't think in terms of his trial, he wasn't given a custodial sentence when he was found guilty, but in terms of the specifics of what he did and did actually admit to. But basically, he was a hacker. And when he hacked all these millions and millions of pages of documents in relating to dozens and dozens of clubs, he was arrested and put on trial, and that's that. But so that's who Rui Pinto is. And when he was, you know, waiting for his various trials, there were law enforcement agencies, including Interpol, and law enforcement agencies in Portugal, Belgium, and other countries who were desperate to talk to him, and they used his information and some of the documents he obtained to bring criminal charges against tax evaders and other people. So, yes, you know, he's a hacker. He would argue that he was doing it in order to try and clean up football. Law enforcement agencies obviously wanted his information to help them clamp down on criminality. And you could argue that City were collateral damage because the documents that he got from them purport to show all sorts of wrongdoing. So that's who Rui Pinto is. And it was as a result of the leaks files that City were charged. And long story short, UEFA charged City again, found them guilty, banned them from the Champions League for 2 years, and then City took the case to CAS on appeal and had the ban overturned, and they had a €30 million fine for non-cooperation reduced, but they still paid a 10 million fine euros for non-cooperation, because they obviously stymied the investigation as much as they could all along the way. So they didn't have a Champions League ban, they just had the non-cooperation. Only after the cascade.
Nick, can I jump in a touch more on this?
Sure.
You often hear Pep Guardiola, the sort of headline, "We were found not guilty at CAS."
Yeah.
But my interpretation is that they were still found guilty, but the penalty was charged at CAS. But perhaps explain it a little bit more, because I think this is so important, because Pep creates this mindset that they were cleared at CAS and UEFA. Is that correct?
No, they were. There was a ruling by the 3-man panel that there wasn't, or there was it was one of these. It was insufficient evidence or no evidence of the key most biggest allegation was disguised funding. In the same, but there were some charges which they apparently were guilty of, but they were time barred, so they didn't get charged with that. So that was also a factor. And of course, they didn't cooperate, and they were fined for not cooperating. In terms of the evidence, there's 2 expert sort of accountants, one for operating on behalf of Man City and one operating on behalf of UEFA, and they both turned in reports to sort of give their version of reading of accounts to sort of help the 3-man panel work out what had gone. And the 3-man panel, by majority verdict, agreed that these accountants had done exemplary work But they also agreed that they were not given access to the information they needed to be definitive about what had or hadn't happened. So that's another sort of question mark over the CAS process. Then there's the issue of, were UEFA just blasé that they banned City and they just assumed that it would be a no-brainer that CAS would uphold it? Did they just have, they didn't have an appetite to like continue prosecuting City? They were given, UEFA had an opportunity where they could have spent more time demanding more evidence, and then within 24 hours decided not to demand extra evidence, which was a bit strange. So that's basically what happened at CAS. So when they say we were not guilty, there was on the most damning charge, there wasn't enough evidence. The accountants, the two key accounting witnesses, were not given access to the information they needed. And in the case of UEFA's accountant, the expert witness for UEFA, he said he just saw the tip of the iceberg. He didn't see all the accounts for the different companies that he would have needed to do. They weren't criticised for bad reports. They did the best what they could with the material. But I think that's also important, because a £10 million fine for non-cooperation, we're saying this now like it's nothing that who cares about. It's just 10 million euros. It's a big sanction. It's a big sanction. And I think you have to take on board that's City paid the fine because they cooperated, and in not cooperating, the people, including the witnesses who needed to know what was going on, didn't have access to the information they needed.
And I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but if you non-cooperate in a doping test by not providing your blood or your urine, you are assumed guilty. It's sort of, how should you treat the non-provision of information requested? But maybe I'm jumping forward a bit, because maybe that's partly what the Premier League charges are about.
Yeah, so you're right with doping. I mean, if you refuse to cooperate, if you just simply refuse to give a doping sample, I think you might be able to. I think you probably have to do 3: either don't turn up, or not be available, or
if you go out the window at the training ground, Nick, because you're on site, you can only miss one. That's a failure.
No, exactly. I mean, we talk about doping today on the day that Paul Pogba's been banned for 4 years for testosterone, which in itself is a big story, and doping in football is an interesting subject for another day. But yeah, so non-cooperation, but the non-cooperation, of course, has the knock-on effect that some of the witnesses don't have the information they required in order to do the job properly, and the panel actually rule this in the ruling, the outcome document. So to say that City was sort of entirely innocent is not true, but they were cleared on the available evidence of disguised funding. But the witnesses as well go in to be specific about, well, how can we know, because we don't have the information to actually tell whether there is or not. So that's that. Anyway, they were cleared. They were not. They were fined just the 10 million, and they were allowed to continue. I reported a lot of sort of the stuff a year later in 2021, some of the detail of what had happened at CAS, having obtained more material about anomalies in City's claims of innocence. And also having established that City were desperately trying to keep secret the fact that the Premier League and them were now in a really, really sort of bad-tempered legal battle as the Premier League investigated alleged allegations against City. In fact,
you expect that, Nick, that investigation to be a private affair, and it's only when a charge is actually levied that will become public. So the investigation can be between the club and the Premier League, and that's normal business.
Yeah, that's normal business. I mean, the Premier League had announced it had opened investigation in late 2018, and then said we won't be commenting until this is finished. So they had said, but what was actually happening is it was becoming very heated and very contentious, and a document was accidentally put into the public domain on the judiciary.org website, sort of laying out how non-cooperative City were being, and how City were trying to stymie the Premier League's investigation, and in fact try and get a judgment that the Premier League didn't even have jurisdiction to do the investigation. And the Mail on Sunday at the time, we hired an independent external QC who basically argued for what is known as open justice, that after so many years of this investigation, it was heading for 3 years long, and it was becoming really embittered. We were arguing that fans and the wider general public should at least be able to know this thing's going on. And the judge actually agreed with us. So we were able to report it. And Justice Mayles, one of the judges who was involved in the case, released a statement. I haven't got it in front of me, but basically saying, you know, City might well feel aggrieved. And it might be that they're never actually charged with anything, but this has been, you know, they've already won however many trophies since this thing started. It's basically saying, isn't it, it's time to get this sorted out. And here we are 3 years later, and the charges, 115 charges later, and obviously it's still rumbling on. If anyone has got an appetite to read reams and reams of documents, emails, correspondence, other paperwork, I, again, in the materials that you'll be getting, have linked to all sorts of documents around allegations of financial malpractice in relation to Abu Dhabi sponsors, in relation to Roberto Mancini and his 2 contracts, alleged illicit payments to Yaya Toure, and forbidden international trading of underage players and payments to their relatives. All the documents are there. There's a click. There's literally hundreds of pages. Fast forward, the Premier League opened its inquiry in autumn 2018, based on the leaks material, and barely uttered a word until they were charged in February last year. Let's go to the overview of the charges. They relate to matters that fall into 5 broad categories, including failing to provide accurate financial information. So that would broadly be, did Manchester City give inaccurate information particularly about their sponsors, to the Premier League back in 11, 12, 13, whenever. That's
Nick, are you listing these in order of severity or volume charges, or?
It's in order. Again, there's a link on the PDF that everyone will get, which actually lists, the Premier League lists 115 charges, and they're sort of set out in 5 categories. So I'm just going through the order that they're set out. So
you're not making any judgment on what's minor, what's major, what's
No, I think most people would agree that the most significant one is, were they not telling the truth about funding, where it was coming from? That's kind of the biggest one, because if for example, the money that Etihad were paying City was actually coming ultimately from City's owner, and they had, and they were massively overinflating what Etihad were paying through whatever mechanism, that's a pretty serious charge. It could also be the case, however, that City were providing financial information to the Premier League about different deals that simply wasn't true at the time. It wasn't maybe full disclosure. I mean, we don't know, because nobody knows what the specific charges are. This whole thing has been, leak proof, pretty much. And so we don't know what the specific charges are. But
right, I've broken your flow. Number 1, non-disclosure.
Yeah, basically, or not disclosing accurate financial information.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Not disclosing full details of Mancini's wages. So Mancini had a contract with a club in Abu Dhabi and also Manchester City. So were they effective? And the documentation would suggest they're paying him a lot of money to be a consultant for some days a year in Abu Dhabi, so that his Manchester City salary is much lower. He's earning more money because he's got 2 contracts, but the wages that Manchester City Football Club pay him is the one that appears in Manchester City's books. So the key allegation there is they are paying, they're basically artificially lowering their costs. So that's the Mancini allegation.
Yep.
Also, another allegation is around not disclosing certain payments to players, including Yaya Toure. And I think from some of the documents we've seen, probably via relatives to underage players, including Brahim Diaz, maybe even Jadon Sancho. There's certainly documentation around this. So again, making payments that are not within the rules and perhaps not declared. The third tranche of charges is actually around the fact that Manchester City broke UEFA's FFP rules. And there's a fourth tranche of charges, which is that the Manchester City broke the Premier League's own profitability and sustainability rules. And the fifth tranche of charges is of not cooperating with the Premier League between 2018 and the current day. So those are 5 charges, 115. We can't be more specific. We don't know exactly, but it's a lot of charges.
No statute of limitations. They can go back and look at Mancini and all that old stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's the case, the tribunal will be held under English law, so there is a statute of limitations of, I think it's 6 years. However, that can be waived if the alleged offences are deemed to be serious enough, egregious enough, and serious enough. So I'm presuming that's what the Premier League, given that they've laid charges relating back to 2009, I think, onwards, they obviously feel they've got a case. But I haven't seen the evidence above and beyond hundreds of pages of Der Spiegel stuff and stuff that I've learned over the years about what was happening. We don't know what the specific charges are. We do know that it's taken 5.5 years to get to this point, and 4.5 years before charges were laid. And
Do you think
cost
is that continual? Is that continual work, or is it stop, start, don't do anything for 6 months, put it in the
Well,
too difficult box?
Well, from the court case in 2021, it was seen quite a lot of time was spent trying to drag information out of City, try to get them to disclose it. And City kept throwing up legal barriers to try and stymie the process, trying to argue that Premier League didn't even have the jurisdiction to be doing this investigation. And then when who was the appointment? The Premier League made an appointment, and the guys and one of the lawyers involved on the Premier League side is an Arsenal fan. And
I remember this.
Manchester City made a legal case that he was biased because he's an Arsenal fan, and therefore he shouldn't be in any position anywhere near this. And of course, Manchester City's KC is one of the best known KCs in Britain, and his name's Lord Panic, and he is an Arsenal fan. I mean, so the idea that City were trying to get the price derailed because there's an Arsenal fan involved on the Premier League side is, well, whatever. You can make up your own mind. I mean, these things are legally complex. What we do know,
the charges have been out there for a year now. So where are we now?
was it the 6th, 7th of February? It was definitely that week in February. I was taking a holiday. I was in Rossniger in Anglesey, actually having a week off, and the story broke. And obviously the office rang and said, "I know you're on holiday, but can you?" I said, "Not really. I don't want to go. You know, I'm completely sick and tired of Manchester City's writing this Manchester City story. So if you need any help with stuff, fine. But no, they, you know, that day I thought this feels pretty enormous. But of course, we don't know which way it's going to go. What we know is that a date has been set for the independent panel to hear the case. That's a 3-person independent panel who will hear this case, made up of judges and eminent legal people. That will reportedly happen this autumn. Don't know. It's been reported that, but it hasn't been confirmed. It could go on for time, a number of times, certainly weeks, I would think, not just days. It could be 5 weeks, several months, the actual hearing. I mean, when you're thinking of 115 charges and the complexity of what's happening, it could go on for ages. And then there'll be a period of time when, you know, the judge of the panel have to go away and deliberate and decide what their verdict is, and then come up with full written reasons. Now, when you understand that Everton faced a single charge of breaking the PSR rules, and when they were initially docked 10 points for that single breach, the full written reasons ran to 41 pages for a single charge for a single breach. And when they got 4 of their points back and it got changed to 6 this week, the full written reasons for the change was 61 pages. I mean, God knows how long the full written reasons of the 115 are going to be. Whichever way it goes, whether they're innocent or guilty, the panel will have to explain to the parties and to the public what happened here. So at least eventually we will know specifically what they're charged with. And that's going to take months, I presume. And then I believe we will, in fact, be told what the verdict is. And then there'll be an appeal process. Probably, 100% City will appeal if they're found guilty. And I guess, depending what they think of the strength of the case, if the Premier League lose, they may or may not appeal. So,
Nick, just to jump in here,
yeah,
so many people on this call will be interested because you hear about it.
yeah,
It's nigh on impossible this is resolved during this Premier League season.
I don't think it can be. If that autumn figure is correct, and that was reported by Mike Keegan of the Mail, who's a Manchester reporter. So, I mean, I know nothing's coming out of the Premier League because I've been trying to get information out of the Premier League for 5 years, and it's as breach as unleaky as anything I've ever known. I mean, when the charges were actually made public in February last year, it was just dropped without even a press release onto the Premier League's website. And Martin Ziegler of the Times, one of his colleagues at the Times who loves fantasy football, was checking his fantasy football team that day. And he saw on the news page there was a statement, and he thought, so he rang Martin. He said, "Look, I don't know if this is important, but there's a story on the Premier League website that says City have been charged with 115 allegations of financial impropriety." And Martin then broke the story. But that's how secretive the Premier League and how leak-proof they've been with this process.
Is it important they're leak-proof?
Yes.
Because if it did leak, would City use that to say that the process was undermined? So while we're frustrated we don't know what's going on, it's probably good for natural justice to play out.
100%, because during the UEFA process, there were some leaks to New York Times and one or two other places, just bits and pieces of information about the progress of the case. And Manchester City, of course, jumped on that to allege that, it was all part of a conspiracy to stitch them up, and journalists were involved and people were talking blah, blah, blah. So I'm 100% sure that the Premier League have decided that from the day in 2018 when they announced this investigation, they were damn sure they were not going to, nobody was going to get anything out of them for that very reason, so that as and when it's all played out, they can say, well, we've been leak proof. So I don't know where Mike got his story, but as I said, he's a Manchester reporter. I would be as certain I could be about virtually anything that he didn't get it from the Premier League. So anyway, we don't even know if it's confirmed, but apparently autumn, weeks and months of trial, months of deliberation and doing a report. So I would expect the verdicts one way or another. Well, I mean, in my notes, I've said between late 24 and spring 25, but speaking to some other people about how long the process could be in terms of the actual trial itself and then the deliberation, I would be looking into 2025. And Stefan Borson, the lawyer I mentioned earlier, who's the City fan and is very, very experienced in complex litigation around areas like this, albeit in business rather than football and sport. Stefan was saying he wouldn't be surprised if it's 2026, but we don't know. We don't know. I'm going to quickly rattle through the other stuff because then people can ask questions and not listen to me drone on more and more. Why is this case taking a lot longer than charges against Everton and Forest? Everton Forest faced 2 charges and 1 charge respectively. One Everton charge has been dealt with, the other is pending. Forest, so it's just 1 charge, and really it's fairly straightforward case of did they exceed losses of £105 million in a 3-year period. Everton's first charge was dealt with, but it still took months. They got a 10-point penalty, reduced to 6 points this week. The other charge is pending, as is Forest's. There will be charges against Chelsea, I'm almost certain, over various things. And it's
sorry, Nick, just that people will be interested in this a bit more. What Chelsea report, the new owners of Chelsea, as I understand it, reported they felt they found evidence of breaking the rules by the Abramovich era. And of course, if you self-report, you hope for a lesser penalty. Is that right?
Yeah, that's obviously what they'll be hoping for. But I'm sure they will be charged, and maybe in mitigation they will, be able to plea bargain down. But the Todd Bowley clown car did self-report, and that.
And what were those charges about, Nick?
It was about I think player transfers was one thing, and
third party payments, Tim. So on the transfers, paying people you didn't disclose you were paying. Yeah,
basically payments that are banned under the rules in relation to player trading. And I can't remember if there's another, but anyway, I would expect Chelsea to be charged, and then that's that. So it's both the number of charges against City, 115, and their complexity, because they're charged with these 5 different things and lots of sub things within the 5 things, as well as City's constant legal challenges, including over the Arsenal supporting, panelists lawyer that have contributed to the process taking more than 5.5 years so far. And I think that is also evidenced by the Open Justice Court disclosures we got in 2021. The timetable of what happens next, as I said, we've gone through that. A 3-man tribunal panel will consider the charges and hear City's evidence and take months to reach verdicts, blah, blah, blah. And nobody knows for sure. Will City be convicted? Which I guess people are interested in. I think there's several reasons they might be convicted, and there's several reasons that they might not. I'll rattle through them. Will they be convicted? As I said before, the Premier League will have paid extremely close attention to City's tactics and legal arguments when getting their cash ban overturned. it would prove a huge act of folly if the league had charged City without believing they've seen at least reasonable grounds and some proof that they can make the charges stick. The Premier League spent 4.5 years investigating before charging. I have no idea whether they've got hitherto unknown documents that blow a hole in City's defence or even a whistleblower. But you know, they didn't have to make 115 charges. They could have levied a single charge of non-cooperation against City. Everyone would have been, a lot of the other clubs would have been pissed off with that. City would have, you know, probably taken it on the chin because it's, you know, they could get a fine or whatever for that. But the Premier League didn't do that. So again, maybe I'm assuming that just because they've pressed the button on 115 charges, they've got a degree of confidence. At CAS, inexplicably, as we mentioned before, UEFA turned down the chance to spend longer trying to gather more evidence, and they also allowed City to nominate 2 of the 3-man panel. UEFA could have vetoed the chair of the panel, the third person that City nominated, but UEFA chose not to veto it, so that's fine. There's nothing illegal there. There's no suggestion that the third panelist from Portugal is corrupt or was in the pay of City or anything like that. But that won't be the case. You know, that won't be the case in the independent panel, that they will have any kind of influence over what happens in that panel.
That was a question from Nick Clark on the chat. He said, "Will they get to pick this time?" You think not?
No, I mean the independent panel will be appointed. I don't think they get to pick. No.
Good. You got that one, Nick. Thank you.
And then you know, did UEFA just get sick of the whole thing? They needed certainty over the next season's Champions League and the next season's Champions League. They knew that they'd been, you know, they'd spent so much money on legal costs. City were going to, you know, City in one of the emails, you know, had already sort of boasted, if we have to pay the 30 best lawyers in the world millions of pounds to, you know, keep these people at bay, we'll do so. And they've been kind of as good as with their word. So maybe UEFA just got sick of it and, you know, didn't take all the options available to them. And obviously at CAS, some of the key witnesses were assessed by the judging panel as honest and transparent, and only later did we see that Simon Pearce apparently perjured himself. But because we have not had any answers to questions about that and haven't been able to speak to Simon, we don't know. 4 reasons City might not be convicted. They may be completely innocent. Prior breaches and acceptance of punishments were honest mistakes, and all the documents suggesting concealed sponsorship and other payments are just not true. And it's all just, it's all fanciful, and everything that has been reported about them, and they are entirely innocent. That's one reason. Second reason, this is complex litigation, and a key plank of City's defence at CAS was whatever any documents or emails have said doesn't mean that the events they describe actually happened. That's me paraphrasing, not a literal thing. In other words, just because you've got a bunch of documents apparently to show dodgy behaviour doesn't mean that behaviour happened. Which again is a legal point, but it's an important legal point. Disclosure is another reason the Premier League do not have any jurisdiction to get their hands on some of these documents. When Simon Pearce, that key government figure, was emailing from an Abu Dhabi government account, the Premier League don't have any jurisdiction over the Abu Dhabi government. They can't. It's not like they were using Man City accounts for a lot of these emails. So if there was a disclosure issue where the Premier League just simply can't get their hands on material because they don't have any jurisdiction over it, that could be a problem. Again, we don't know. You'd have to assume they don't press the button on the charges without feeling they've got some evidence, but who knows? And the last one, geopolitics. This is where this is the end of my bit. I've probably gone on too long. Sheikh Mansour is the Deputy Prime Minister of a key regional ally of the United Kingdom. If you don't think various avenues will be exploited and explored to make this whole thing go away, or at least mitigate what happens, then I don't think you have a future as a diplomat. We had MBS of Saudi Arabia WhatsApping Boris Johnson to get him to get everyone's fingers pulled out and get the Newcastle deal. When you've got some of the most powerful, richest people in the world reminding the British government that their key regional allies are rich and invest all this money in Britain, you know, it's clearly a possibility that they'll do everything they can to stop this happening, or to mitigate it, or to get the government involved in speeding it up. I mean, I don't think that's not a conspiracy theory. We already know. I think, yeah, it was The Athletic have already had a freedom of information request responded to that shows that the British government and the Abu Dhabi government, you know, have been talking about this, but the freedom of information request was turned down on the grounds of British national interest, and it could be damaged if the conversations between Abu Dhabi and Britain were revealed. So it's already been admitted. Some talks have gone on, but we don't know what those talks are. And that's it. It's not really in a nutshell. That was in something more like an enormous coconut. But that's the background. That's where we are with the 115 charges. I think its relevance to a lot of football fans, but obviously particularly football fans who've been directly competing with Manchester City in recent years, whether that is Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester United, whether it's clubs that, might have been relegated because whatever, they were being beaten by City heavily that affected their goal difference. There's a lot of football clubs are interested in this. And I don't think it's not the case that anyone is out to get Manchester City. It's that the allegations against them are extraordinary. The stuff that we've got in the public domain about the allegations is looks damning, and now we have to wait and see what happens. But I don't think it's unusual for fans of a lot of clubs to be interested in this. Like you said, you invited me on here to talk about it. I haven't been begging you to please let me speak about FFP again and Manchester City. I'm sick of it. I'm as sick of it as everyone else. I wish that it had been cleared up years ago. And but that's where we are.
There's some great questions on the chat, Nick. One from a long-standing AST member, was a shareholder in Arsenal, Hans Lagarde.
Yeah.
And he says, with the points deductions which we've seen for Everton and potentially coming for Forest, how can we be sure that these things will be adjudicated, appealed, and whatever, all within one playing season, and we're not rolling over one season to the next? If it's a points, not financial, not a fine, but if we're going down the points route.
Yeah, well, I think the Premier League have committed in terms of the Nottingham Forest and Everton to have dealt with those cases in this season, right? I think that's a commitment. So we're talking about, what have they got? 3 more months to charge Forest, or they've charged Forest to deal with Forest and deal with Everton's second charge. I mean, there isn't a commitment on Man City apart from that we now know there's a tribunal, so at least the thing will get going. But I don't think anybody can know how long it might drag on. Like I said, there's a different opinion. Stefan, who's an experienced lawyer, thinks it could go to 2026. So yeah, it's complex. And basically there aren't any guarantees apart from the ones that I think they've given on Everton and Forest.
And a continuation on that theme, I think there were 1 or 2 questions on this, Nigel. You can probably see them easier than me. Clubs that feel they've lost out, you just mentioned Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester United competing with City. A really big difference is if you qualify for the Champions League or not, and the money you earn. Could these clubs subsequently have legal redress for financial loss, or does it just do they all sign up to Premier League rules and you have to like it or lump it, the impact it has on your own income and sort of brand and positioning in football?
Well, we know that they do have legal redress if that's the route they want to go down, because we've got a precedent of what happened with Mascherano and Tevez at West Ham when they were signed as third-party players, and Sheffield United went down, didn't they? West Ham stayed up, and I think West Ham ended up paying £20 million in compensation to Sheffield United. I think that's the figure, don't quote me on precisely. So that's a precedent. I think it does get enormously complex around supposing City were guilty, and if they were guilty of a lot of the charges and ended up with, I don't know, say they're guilty of 30 charges and they're docked 4 points for each of the charges or whatever, enough to get them relegated, basically. And even Stefan agrees, if they are found guilty of the most serious charges, Stefan has gone on record as saying, and this is a City fan who's an expert in these matters, that they will have to be relegated, basically. I mean, it's obviously a big if, but let's say they had a big points penalty, or found guilty and it's a big points penalty. Then what do you do? It's not a simple, I don't think, this is my view, not an official policy, but my view is it's not as simple as just saying Liverpool finished runner-up that year and they're now champions. What you'd actually have to do is you'd have to if you're going to be fair about it, you'd need to vacate all of City's results individually and then see what the table looked like. So if somebody got relegated because they were humped 6-0 and 4-0 by City, and then those results are vacated, and suddenly they've got a better goal difference enough to keep them. It's so complicated. So I don't know that. I mean, I'd be, and people I speak to are just not. It's very much, well, let's deal with that when we come to it, because it's so complex. There is not a current plan for what you do.
I was just thinking, Nigel, we probably got trounced home and away by City when we missed out on the Champions League by 1 point under Unai Emery. Does Unai Emery have a claim that he would still be Arsenal manager, but for City's cheating? But let's not go too far down that rabbit hole, maybe.
But also you will have individual clubs who might say, well, they might look at a particular season and say, well, City did beat us this and this, and we ended up going down on goal difference. And if we hadn't lost those 2 matches by those amount of goals, or if you vacate the results, we're staying up. And you might well get a club who 4 or 5 years ago that happened to. So there's obviously the potential for an absolute minefield of claims. I would suggest it's, as happened in the scandal in Italy, the Calciopoli scandal. Juventus, the title was just not re-awarded. It was just like vacated. But I mean, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. I think as and when it gets to that, it's a bloody minefield.
Kevin Witcher asked exactly the same thing, Nick. Is there any precedent from what's happened in other countries, or that's irrelevant to what happens with the Premier League? Juventus being the question there.
Well, Juventus was stripped of a title. Were they relegated as well? I think they spend a season down in Serie B. Anyway, but the title was just, it wasn't re-awarded. But I mean, the clubs who missed out, only they and their owners can know what sort of action they would take, and the stakes are so high for everybody. I mean, imagine if you've got whole dozens of football clubs bringing financial claims on whatever basis against Manchester City, should they be guilty. Even against the league for, I don't know, not doing something earlier or whatever, it becomes very complicated. And I think the easiest thing to do is let's wait and actually see what happens in the independent panel. Manchester City fans, almost to a man, are 100% convinced that they are completely innocent and will be vindicated, and that may well happen. That's a possibility.
Slightly bizarre that Man City will be paying 5% of the Premier League legal costs by their ownership. This is Mark Brindle and Mark Stevens asking about who's funding this. Is there a bottomless pit of Premier League money for legal fees? And when that runs out, does that mean the Premier League has to have a cash call from clubs, or do they just retain more from the next centrally negotiated TV contract because their legal budget is blown?
The Premier League is funding this, and I have been told
that's the clubs then.
Yeah. So ultimately, you've got a pot of Premier League money of £3 billion a year from TV rights and sponsorship or whatever, and that's obviously divided up at the end of each year between the 20 clubs on blah blah basis. So the Premier League has legal costs and running costs and whatever. So this is coming out of the costs are coming out of Premier League central funds, and it runs into, I believe, millions of pounds a year since 2018. Millions of pounds a year. Now, obviously, in the grand scheme of things, when the club finishing bottom of the Premier League get £100 million in central funds, or £105 million, and the top team get 165, if it's costing, I don't know, £5 million a year for the last few years, then each club is ceding £250,000, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot. And because the Premier League effectively have to have the tacit backing of doing this from their clubs, then you would have to imagine that the majority of clubs are supporting this investigation and the prosecution of City. Not that they were given a choice in it, but clearly clubs who might benefit from City being found guilty would have an incentive for them to be prosecuted if the Premier League felt that it was right to prosecute them. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not loads of money, but basically the bottom line is the Premier League, i.e. the clubs, are paying for this. And Manchester City are obviously funding theirs. I don't know, actually. It's a good question whether, depending who wins, whether the other side have to pick up your costs. I don't know the answer, but that's one I'll have to find out.
Nick, I had a question about disclosure and access to information and the difficulty of getting it. if
Sorry,
the
again,
Prem-
you froze for a second, Tim. Can
Ah,
you repeat it?
no, yeah, I had a question. You mentioned about disclosure and the Premier League sometimes maybe struggling to get the information they needed.
Yeah.
I've read that one of the arguments in favour of there being an independent football regulator, which we're waiting any day now to see if the government brings the legislation forward, is it could give that regulator the same powers as, I don't know, the Serious Fraud Office or the Financial Conduct Agency when they investigate crime and issues there. Do you think that's right, or do you think that's a sort of wishful thinking?
I think the regulator will have powers to regulate football clubs. So it won't have any power to regulate the government of Abu Dhabi. I mean, the government of the UAE. It just won't. I mean, it can't. A football regulator in England cannot force a sovereign government to hand over information if they don't want to. So I don't think the regulator's going to suddenly have greater powers. Certainly, it's nothing has been suggested to me is the case. In fact, until we know what the regulator looks like, who it's going to be, where it's going to be based, what it's funded, and what its actual duties are, which are primarily going to be financial monitoring by the sounds of it, and get involved in some issues around integrity and supporter concerns, whether that's ticket prices, kickoff times, TV deals, whether betting advertising should be allowed, blah, blah, blah. It will be a regulator that will basically be trying to make sure that football is financially well run for a start, and financially fair, and that the same rules apply to everyone, and then look at issues like integrity, general integrity issues, whether it's betting or whatever.
There's an interesting one here, Nick, it's another Nick, Nicholas Earl Kwaku.
Yeah.
I know we haven't brought you on about this, but do you think this creates a warning for other clubs, certainly around the financial breaches, but specifically around Arsenal? People can have their views on where the transfers are going, and you can see the losses which are being recorded. It's less easy to see what the good investment or good spending is compared to the other. But do you think this will put other clubs on notice to say this is open season now, so clean up your house?
Yeah, I think that's already happened. I think a lot of clubs were shocked. It was November, wasn't it, when they got the 10-point penalty, Everton? And I think a lot of people were shocked. Obviously, Everton was shocked, and now it's only 6 points. But it was still the clubs being shown, we're coming after you, And I think that will obviously impact the behaviour of the clubs. And if that makes the clubs financially more healthy, then I don't particularly see that it's a bad thing. But of course, there's an ongoing debate, even as we speak, over whether the Premier League should continue with their PSR rules, which allow losses of £105 million over 3 years, or whether actually they should move something akin to the new FFP rules of UEFA, which are, I don't want to bore you watchers, listeners, whatever, but basically this season clubs will be able to spend 90% of their or they won't be able to spend more than 90% of their income on a combination of transfer fees, agents fees, and wages. And that will go, and that will reduce to not more than 80% next season, and then 70% the season after that. So that's a graduated thing. There is a debate that, well, but actually the Premier League should just adopt that now instead of having PSR, which works on a different mechanism.
Yeah, we've had an hour of you now, and the questions are still coming in. I'll let Ackle run the timing, but I hope you're okay. David Maxwell's gone a bit technical on us.
Right.
I don't know. Do you know who the auditors were for Man City during this period? Arsenal have their accounts out, audited by Deloitte, so decent firm you would have hoped. Is there any question for the auditors to be more scrupulous with helping the fulfillment of some of these obligations?
Yeah, who are the auditors? I do know this, but it's not. But yeah, I mean, of course, the issue is if what Man City have been accused of is proven, then it's effectively false accounting over over a number of years, and anyone party to that accounting, whether accountants, auditors, or whatever, will have played a role in it. However, there's been any number of major financial scandals where auditors have absolutely been implicated in part of it, either because they were just doing what they were asked to or told to, or because they weren't given the whole picture. And also, we are talking about a set of football rules here. it would not be a criminal offence for Manchester City to. It's not a criminal offence for Manchester City to spend more money than they're allowed. They've broken some football rules. I mean, I guess you start getting into the weeds of, well, is it a criminal offence of false accounting? Well, I guess it depends, what extent your accounts are fake, and to what extent do your auditors actually know what's actually happened. So, for example, and I'll try and keep this simple, let's say that Etihad were being given the money to pay their sponsorship deals by the government or by Sheikh Mansour, right? So they've got whatever, £99 million of sponsorship obligations. Etihad pay 8 of it themselves, and the other 91 comes from Sheikh Mansour's bank account, right? If Sheikh Mansour puts £91 million of his money into Etihad into their bank account for something, or for whatever reason, and then the money, in terms of the transfer, in terms of the paper trail, is shown as coming out of Etihad's bank account at £99. But of course, what are the auditors supposed to do? Yes, there would be issues for anyone involved in knowingly, cooking the books or whatever. But we don't. Again, there's so much we still don't know about this.
Remind people what happened when the Saudi Arabian Sovereign Wealth Fund came in for Newcastle, and how the Premier League rushed through these rules around fair market value for related party transactions. I know it wasn't a unanimous vote, but that
was just at the end of last year. I mean, that was just at the end of last year, and that was quite deliberately brought in to try and stymie Newcastle United. And I mean, that was obvious. Having said that, the Premier League had not wanted to let the PIF buy Newcastle in the first place, because what they wanted to do is they wanted PIF to put somebody up for a fit and proper person test, right? And actually, Newcastle simply declined to put anyone up. This was the hold-up. It wasn't that the Premier League said, you can't buy the football club. I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but they wanted effectively to maybe have Mohammed bin Salman or whoever be put up for the fit and proper person test. And the Saudis didn't want that, because in order to put somebody up, is he the chairman of PIF? He would have to be scrutinized. Was he involved in the state-sponsored murder of Jamal Khashoggi? What is his final background, or whatever. So a lot of the reason that didn't progress in the first place, because Newcastle simply refused to put anyone up for the test. And you can't buy a football club before passing the test. And then obviously Mohammed bin Salman got involved, and then Newcastle and PIF went away and got binding legal advice that PIF is nothing to do with the state of Saudi Arabia. And then eventually,
which then was the fallacy of that was shown when those individuals were called to the US courts for the league golf thing, and they claimed diplomatic immunity. You can't come up to me, the very same people who had been told were nothing to do with the Saudi government.
Absolutely. And there's still complex legal actions going on around that whole live PGA stuff in America, which is still unfolding. But anyway, there we go.
I'm just going to bring in Malcolm Clark, who's from the FSA. I think, Tim, you might want to lead him in with a question. But Malcolm?
Oh, yes. Hello. Welcome, Malcolm. For people that don't know, Malcolm Clark is the chair of the Football Supporters Association, the organisation we work with many other supporter groups and on issues like having the regulator. And we invited some other supporters and the groups, because we did feel, as we've covered tonight, that this is an issue about the Premier League, about football and about finances. But Malcolm, would welcome your observations and thoughts on what we've heard tonight and what we're talking about.
Hi, Malcolm.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Malcolm. Good to chat.
Hello, Nick. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted that you invited me, Tim, and I've found it an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think, and actually my sort of first thought was, well, can we get you along to our conference in the summer, or contributing to some of our networks? Because I think the issues that you have covered are so fundamentally important to the game. And the challenge that we have as a national organisation is to get fans away from this sort of inter-club rivalry and defence which is going on. As Tim knows, we saw a tweet from somebody from Manchester City saying, well, why are you Arsenal people being so petty as to have a session on this? We had a thing on our network from Everton fans over their judgment. And the challenge, I think, for us is to get above all of this, because I think most fans will recognize the sort of fundamental point that basically cheating isn't acceptable any more off the field than it is on the field. I'd be interested to know, Nick, if you've got any particular thoughts on how we can communicate this very important but highly complex debate in a way that we can engage our members. I know it's more of a question for me possibly than you, but if you had any thoughts on that, because the one thing we can't deny is that this is a very complex subject. And when you talked about the possible changes in the rules, you know, to adopt the UEFA type rules, how do we engage fans and explain those choices and that debate to them? And I think it is quite a big challenge. And my only other question really was, we've had sort of 4 clubs mentioned tonight, apart from City, Everton, Forest, and possibly Chelsea. How many others might there be, do you think? Or is everybody potentially at this in one form or another? And if they are, would that lead to total organisational chaos in a way? Because I can see that it's one thing to charge a particular club with offences if everybody else is obeying the rules. When you're getting into sporting sanctions and sporting advantages, there's all kinds of clubs, various clubs to different extents that are not following the rules properly. You've got a potentially very chaotic situation. So thanks for that. I've gone on a bit longer than I intended, but if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be interested.
So first on the how many clubs could be affected, obviously anyone could be affected, and the clubs are really on notice now that they need to be not overspending. They need to be within the rules, and that it will be clamped down on. I mean, the clubs that are potentially affected, well, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, when he completed his partial buyout of Manchester United last week, was on the record as saying that it's really important for PSR reasons, that's profit and sustainability rules reasons, that Manchester City make it into the Champions League. You know, it's because the golf in what they make from the Champions League, and if they just got into one of the lesser European things, is a lot of money. Now, I think I was looking earlier, City, United, I think at 8 points off 4th at the moment. So it's not necessarily, it's far from a gimme that they're going to get in. And I don't know how crucial it is that they have to get into the Champions League to stop falling foul. But there are mechanisms that if they felt they were in danger, they could offload players, they could sell players, they could cut their wage bill. I think Anthony Martial's going, isn't he? There's a question mark over the future of Casemiro's, and high wage earners that they could get rid of or who are going to be out of contract. They could sell players. So there are things that they could do. Newcastle, Darren Eales, CEO of Newcastle, he went on record in January saying, look, we've got to, you know, potentially they were talking about selling Guimaraes, you know, one of the, or, you know, which player are you going to sell? Are you going to sell Isak or are you going to sell Guimaraes? Because like we're going to have to balance the books. They had a big wage rises since PIF have taken over, and they must be running fairly close to the wind. Again, there are things that they can do, and clearly Newcastle have started doing that and are being open about the fact they need to cut costs. You've got other clubs who traditionally have been super well run. They don't have, you know, massive losses in terms of that would count towards this, whether that's Brighton or Brentford or whoever. And a lot of clubs will be much more keen on that. So that's that point. I think there are other clubs.
There are reports, was it Aston Villa, but I want to be careful I don't get it wrong. Some clubs are changing their year end to try and give themselves like an extra month to get a sale in or to comply with the PSR. But that shows you it's having a real chilling effect on every club.
Yeah, and so the clubs are aware of it, and I think there are other clubs who will be flying close to the wind, but there's nobody that I've heard of who I've specifically heard of who are actually realizing they're definitely in trouble and they're going to get charged. And what was Malcolm? What was your previous question?
will he come along and help educate the wider football community? And
about what? How
if I expand on that as well, I do think it's important. You know, how do we, as fans across the game, and what would happen if it happened at Arsenal? Would we go into the trenches and defend the club, or would we say this is the right thing for the good of the game and long-term health? Because it does seem that when it happens to a club, the fans get very defensive about their club rather than perhaps being critical of those that have got the club there and supporting the wider good of the game by the rules being upheld.
Yeah, I thought Malcolm's invitation was to you, Tim.
No, it's definitely to you, Nick.
Yeah, because I mean, I love, yeah, I'd like to spend my entire summer talking about FFP. That would be a lot of fun. No, in terms of the education piece, Malcolm, and what you in terms of getting fans engaged, the fact is a lot of fans do not give a toss. We know that about this stuff until it directly affects them. They just don't care, right? The people who care, and that's just, it's depressing, and you and I care, and we want the game to be fair, and we want the rules to be in place and whatever. But so many fans just going to want to go and watch their football team with their mates or their kids or their dads and mums and whatever. People want to go to the football. I just want to, there's so much of this stuff professionally that, gives you reasons to sort of despair about what's happening in modern football. But I think a lot of people don't care until it impacts them. So the people who are particularly interested in the Man City case, and obviously it is a subject that gets a lot of attention. I get a lot of questions about it. It really does interest a lot of people. But of course it interests Liverpool fans because they came so close to more titles. And it does, affect Arsenal fans and the clubs who are there. But and it will affect fans of other clubs who just think that, Manchester City have come in, way overspent, have been funded by, the club, obviously, and technically it's in the sole owner, it's a personal venture for Sheikh Mansour. But I don't think there's any doubt that it is supported by the apparatus of state, including all its major sponsors and all a large amount of its commercial income. So I think that a lot of fans, certainly people who talk to me about it and people that I speak to about these issues, they would rather that there was not state ownership of football clubs, that, or state supported ownership of football clubs, because it in itself adds a distorting effect. And I completely accept that there'll be fans of those clubs who are owned by these entities, whether it's PIF or Manchester City, who will point to wider generation of particular cities and areas and massive investment. And City have got a brilliant academy. I'm a Southampton fan, by the way. We've got, 5 or 6 City or former City players either playing for us on loan or who we've bought, including our goalkeeper and Edozie and Harwood Bellis at centre half on loan, and Romeo Lavia, who we bought for 10 or 12 quid from City and then sold to Chelsea for 50 million quid. So I know how good City's academy is, and the infrastructure is great, and the Etihad campus is great. The team are obviously brilliant, and I can see why City fans would obviously be massively indebted and absolutely love Sheikh Mansour. In the same way, Newcastle fans will love PIF because they think it's going to lead them ultimately to competitiveness and trophies. So I see that. But there is a wider view about what football is about and what we want it to be about, and whether states should be owning football clubs and supporting football clubs. So back to Malcolm's point of how do we get people interested? I think there are a lot of people who are interested, but there's a lot of people who think that, one common refrain is, City have been charged, but we know what will happen. They'll get a slap on the wrist or they get off, and that might happen. It might be that they're completely exonerated because they are in fact innocent and do present the mountains of irrefutable evidence that they say they've got. But it is a subject that people are interested in. And again, coming back to my favourite group of people, Manchester City fans who spend their time in chat rooms talking about me for days on end and abusing me on the internet, I completely get why why City fans are angry. It was, the introduction of FFP in the first place by UEFA was just it was a case of bad timing for City, and they ended up falling foul of it. So I can see why, they get angry about the fact that there's constantly, headlines about them and their different alleged discrepancies and whatever. But in terms of what Malcolm, you were saying about uniting football fans, I think that is there's nothing I can see in the way that football fandom currently works that will get supporters uniting on a consensus of what to do, because football is so tribalism. It's not just City, it's every club is tribal to an extent. And so you will have a cohesion, say, about City from a particular group of fans who've most badly been affected if they cheated, understandable. A general discomfort about why it's taken so many years. But to try and actually get a cohesion, I'd be interested, Malcolm, what you as an organization, what do you think? Because you're the leaders here. So do you have a position on state ownership and whatever? Because if you take a lead as a fan organization, speaking to your board members and your stakeholders and see, well, what do fans want? I think that would be interesting. I'm trying to remember the last time we spoke. Was it I think
I mean, Malcolm's sort of just left. People,
right. Okay.
not got the voice anymore, so he won't be able to come back. But I think we'll sort of leave it there. I think that was a good sort of way to end. It was one of those that we when we put this together, we weren't sure what the interest would be like, but we have had lots of questions on stuff like this, and with some really, really strong numbers, great questions, which was obviously really, really good to see. I think it's important to note that this was absolutely nothing personal to Man City or to Everton or to Forest. Obviously, it was just a way of educating our members, and of course, every club is involved. Our last home game of the season is at home to Everton. Now, if Everton have a deduction and they're fighting to stay up, they may need to win at the Emirates to stay up. If they hadn't had a deduction, they may be safe. So it absolutely impacts the whole league, because that then may mean Everton put 10% more against us. It may mean we lose, Liverpool win. It may mean someone else falls into Europe. It absolutely, it affects the whole of the Premier League, which is why we're really keen to have this discussion today. So, Nick, on behalf of our members listening to the podcast, I would like to thank you. I think Tim just wants to come in.
Go on, Nick.
I just want to make one football point, because basically we all love football. I have to say, the last time I went to Emirates, it was amazing. It was in April last year, Friday night game, Southampton, my team. It was incredible. 2-0 up inside, what was it, 16 minutes or whatever. We were winning 3-1 as the clock ticked to 90. And the atmosphere was insane. When it was 3-3 with still minutes to play, there was absolutely no way on God's earth Arsenal were not going to win that match. It was crazy. And of course it was 3-3, and we both slashed each other's throats, because we could have still stayed up realistically if we'd won that match and gone on. And you, obviously, your title hope was sort of in the process of falling apart. But it was a cracking night. It was. It
was. I remember it well. It was as you say, I think we'd just been to Anfield and West Ham and Southampton. There were 3 games where it all started to go wrong. So, well, hopefully.
I think we got 2 draws against you last season, didn't we?
You did. Yeah, you did. You did. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I just thought I'd bring some football into it.
Yeah, no,
but
we may see you back next year. I know it's all very tight and close. I just wanted to say thank you, Nick. That's been incredibly informative and illuminating for people. We can see from the interest. You've put a document together for us, which myself and Akil have seen. We will include that in a newsletter to everybody tomorrow. For those that are interested in this subject, and a lot are, well, people could spend the whole weekend reading, couldn't they? Because you've linked to the cases and the materials and previous articles. It's a fantastic treasure trove of information about it. That will go out to all members within 24 hours in the newsletter. And I just want to say thank you to you again. And I'm sure on other issues, you're an expert on attendances and salaries and all sorts of things. I'm sure we'll welcome you back to another AST meeting in the not too distant future. Well,
thanks for having me. Once people get the PDF, if they've got any other questions, it's easy enough to find my email on the sportingintelligence.com website. As I say, the Substack thing for following, if people want to follow, you can either pay to subscribe, or you can just have a free subscription where you'll get some of the content free every week and the other behind a paywall. And there's a weekly mailbag, a Q&A, which comes out. The plan is most Fridays. So, people can be putting questions into that if they want to follow the Substack and ask me to investigate a particular thing or look at an issue or ask a question. So I'm happy always to engage with football fans. And if people want to get in touch and ask me further questions, that's absolutely fine. It's been a pleasure being with you this evening. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll make sure we include the links and stuff in our sort of next newsletter with your PDF. So just a quick thanks to all the members that have watched or listened or have listened or going to listen to the podcast or have listened to the podcast. We will be back probably next week. I know there's lots of stuff happening at Arsenal with ticketing and stuff like that. There was I think we did put out a tweet yesterday because we did have questions about the Red membership being cancelled and stuff like that. So we did hear from Arsenal. So we have put our response on Twitter, and we will get that out in the newsletter as well. And we'll cover a lot more about ticketing sort of next week. We're planning to do another virtual event next week. So until then, thank you, good night, and up the Arsenal, of course. Cheers, Nick.
Thank you. Cheers. Are we clear?
I think there's still a few people on, aren't there, Michael?
Of course.